We are in the second week of PTR testing for Season 3. This week they are testing the returning War Within dungeons, so Floodgate, Priory, Arakara, and Dawnbreaker, and there was no raid testing this week. Now after a long period of maintenance and server outages this week, they did release a class balance patch. However, it did not really bring major buffs or nerfs to most classes. I will summarize the most important ones. The most notable change is a Breath of Sindragosa rework for Frost DK that removes its interaction with Runic Power Drain completely and makes it an extending duration buff similar to Divine Hammers on Ret or Void Form on Shadow Priest. It also now is a 1.5 minute cooldown, lining up perfectly with Pillar. I would say the average duration seems to be 30 to 40 seconds, however with Lust you can probably get up to 1 minute long breaths. Other changes to DK include a reduction in the cooldown of grip for DPS DKs to 15 seconds to accommodate for the loss of Abon Limb, and a hard cap on Bursting Swords damage for Unholy, which has been overblown a little bit. Bursting Swords isn't really a massive amount of damage for Unholy DK in its current iteration, even on big AoE, although it is a bit demoralizing to see another thing get hard capped. There was the nerf to the Resto Druid tier set, however I believe it is still strong. Marksmanship Hunter got a harsh nerf to Dark Ranger Phantom Pain, target capping it to 8 and halving its damage, and then nerfs to Black Arrow on top of that. These nerfs only serve to stop it being completely broken. It is still definitely looking like one of the strongest AoE specs, and Phantom Pain is still a way higher portion of damage than before. Sentinel was untouched. BM Hunter actually got a pretty big buff disguised as a nerf. They halved the damage of the Stampede tier set at the same time as fixing some bugs that cause Stampede to miss a lot of the time, causing more total damage from Stampede than before. BM Hunter is definitely up there as possibly the strongest overall damage spec right now, boasting even up to overalls of 12 mil. Now Arcane Mage weirdly got a buff on their Spellslinger tree, which was already OP in Mythic Plus and now serves to be even stronger. Arcane is keeping their funnel status from last season while also kind of doing real AoE damage now. I am not sure why this got buffed. Shadow Priest saw a bug fix along with a nerf to compensate, so essentially Shadow is neutral from last week. Enhancement Shaman got an undocumented change to their tier set to make it proc every 8 awakening stacks for a longer duration, which is essentially a neutral change and allows a better flow for the spec. Ellie was unaffected. And Demonology Warlock saw some big buffs to a lot of spells. That summarizes the patch. I don't think there is much different to how classes were last week. Now I want to put some spotlight on Boomy. Boomy was bugged last week through their 2 set, which was doing too much damage. They tried to fix and nerf this 2 set this week, but instead they just turned it off completely, so every Boomy has been playing without part of their tier. But regardless of that, the dungeons that have come back can really highlight how overpowered the burst can be, such as hitting 500 million damage Star Surges on Big Mama, or opening with 80 mil burst on Avanox, instantly shaving off 20% of its health. It does this through the Keeper of the Grove tier set, which causes every cast of Incarn to store the damage you do into a buff that is released on your next 2 Star Surges. It accumulates 5% of your damage with a cap of around 6 million, and then through the extensive amount of multipliers Boomy has, they can then produce Star Surges of 100 million damage or more. Using 2 Incarns in a row makes this more powerful as your first Incarn feeds into the second and you can use a crit from Boat on your Star Surges. But to do this, you have to sandbag on the pulls before and treat your Incarns like a 3-minute cooldown. Boomy overalls are not always the highest because of this, although they are still very competitive. So right now, Boomy has a similar profile to Venthyr Boomy from Shadowlands, but with an option to split up their cooldown into weaker minute 30s. Now if I was to arrange what I thought into a bit of an M+ DPS tier list, I would say it looks a bit like this. I think BM Hunter is far above other specs in terms of overall damage, and Marksmanship is a bit behind that but still ahead of other classes. However, Hunter is kind of overtuned, so I expect some nerfs here. Then I think Arcane and Boomy are doing insane things with their prio, while at the same time proven to have very strong utility that causes them to be brought almost every season regardless. I'm not sure if there will be nerfs to these specs. And then there are a few other specs I have seen pop off that could be competitive if Hunter gets nerfed. I don't have enough data on the specs that I have not ranked. I apologize, and I will make a more official tier list in the future. Looking at tanks, the general consensus seems to be that the 3 competitive tanks are Prot Warrior, VDH, and Brewmaster. Prot Warrior has a build that has a lot of self-healing through uncapped leech from bleeds. VDH is unchanged from Season 2, and Brewmaster seems like it does a good amount of damage. A lot of people are playing it, nothing crazy though. For healers, Disc Priest is mostly unchanged from Season 2 again. These specs just keep dodging nerfs, so I don't really get it. And Resto Druid, despite the nerf, is still doing good healing, not sure if it's enough. The actual dungeons that we got for testing seem a bit harder than their Season 1 and 2 equivalents. Arakara is the big offender here. The little flying mobs in the first pool give a stacking bleed that does way more damage than it used to. 1 or 2 stacks is kind of manageable, but the issue arises that its application is kind of random, and they can all target one person to give them a lot of stacks. Highest I've seen is 8 stacks. Then we have the poison crawlers, who now instantly cast their poison and it stacks. This becomes super punishing if you don't have many poison dispels because one person can quickly just stack up to 4. And also they made it so that these crawlers don't explode when they hit 30%. You don't have to fully kill them. The one redeemable thing about this area is Nact, the mini boss that used to do a massive AoE incredibly quickly, got massively nerfed and his AoE does far less damage and is also over a longer duration. It really doesn't do much damage anymore. The bosses are definitely scaled a bit different. Avanox is quite hard with Gossamer Onslaught being buffed by 50%, so that the boss just slams you with scary AoE damage events one after another the whole fight. They doubled the failure damage on a noob Zect, so that if you stand in a tornado, you are very scared. And on the last boss, they made it a lot easier. There are only 3 people per set who get poison, and one is always the tank. In Dawnbreaker, they added a few commanders and ritualists to packs in the town. These are the big mobs from the start of the dungeon that use Tormenting Beam or Bleed the Tank. So a few of the easy free pulls from the last season of Dawnbreaker are not so free anymore. They did make the Shadow Elementals easier by removing Dark Flows, and they did remove Umbral Rush from the Shadow Walkers but replace it with a stacking debuff that reduces healing on the tank like Necrotic. You also can't line the dot from the mini bosses anymore. The first boss is a bit harder to heal with all its non-tank damage buffed, and also the circles now go on melee even if you have range in the group, making boss positioning harder. The rest of the bosses seem unchanged. In Priori, they nerfed some mobs on the right side. A lot of my groups have been experimenting with right side, and it still seems quite hard. Lots of dangerous mobs in each pool, and the pats can get really close to you. On the first boss, the new area denial mechanic is quite annoying and causes some constraints with melee uptime. If you go right side and play Tanner on this boss, it is quite scary, as a single missed kick on Tanner can one-shot someone, and you also still need to kick Captain Dalcry's Battle Shout. From the second boss room onwards, Priori is almost exactly the same. It's just the Fireball Volley is a bit shorter cast. In Operation Floodgate, they killed Bubbles completely, rest in peace. And the pack by the box near Big Mama was moved well out of the way, so you don't need to do an intricate walk skip there anymore. The rest of the dungeon is the same. There was no raid testing this week, so I have nothing to report in terms of the raid or class balancing with regards to the raid. Full mythic testing will be next week. And also next week will be dungeon testing for Halls of Atonement, Tazavest Streets, and Tazavest Gambit. And also probably more class tuning. Thanks for watching. Remember, I will be streaming PTR testing on many classes up until season launch.